Ecotourism in Brazil. Now, that might sound a little scary because Brazil does have a bit of a reputation for being a bit dangerous, but actually, ecotourism in Brazil is not that hard as long as you follow some basic tips. And ecotourism in Brazil has some advantages because it's not really a big thing in many places, and you might find many hotspots, birding hotspots and wildlife hotspots that are relatively unknown. So therefore, when you go to Brazil, you'll find that you can be pretty much by yourself and view wildlife without having a lot of people crowding around you, as it is in some places in North America. So actually, I think ecotourism in Brazil is very worth it. And I'm going to tell you today some tips on how to make that experience a lot better. Tip number 1, learn a little Portuguese. Now, most of the time in smaller towns in Brazil, you're not going to find many people speaking English or other languages. And Portuguese is the dominant language here. It's the main language. So if you don't know any Portuguese, you're going to have a very hard time just finding your way around, talking to people, communicating with Airbnb hosts, etc. So I really recommend learning at least a little bit of Portuguese, how to pronounce it, how to read words, and go on Duolingo. Spend at least 2 or 3 months before your trip learning as much Portuguese as you can. It'll make your trip a lot more pleasant compared to if you don't know any Portuguese at all. Tip number 2, go minimal with your gear. Now, most of the time in these smaller places like I am today, I'm in the Atlantic rainforest, it's pretty safe. Nevertheless, I do recommend going minimal with your gear. So that means not bringing all your cameras, not bringing all your lenses, just bringing 1 or 2 lenses, focus on one kind of photography. And I recommend that because Brazil is a little bit dangerous in certain places. For example, if you're at the airport or if you're going to stay one night in a big city, or even if you're out in a place like this, you don't want to be carrying extreme amounts of gear. There are some situations where you might find it's a little dangerous to be carrying around so much expensive gear. So I do recommend going minimal, focusing on one kind of photography. You know, right now I'm doing bird photography. I've got my 500mm lens here. On this trip, I didn't bring a lot of other gear. I decided to leave my wide-angle lens at home. I decided to leave my macro lens at home. It's generally a good idea to go minimal. And with that tip, I also recommend being discreet. So that means don't carry around too many bags that look like camera bags. Keep your camera in your backpack and just carry enough that fits in a backpack so you just look like anyone else, any other tourist. Don't carry around a gigantic lens case that obviously is a 600mm lens, things like that. Just be smart and discreet and carry a small amount of gear in unassuming packages. Tip number 3 is find your own way and do your research. So things in Brazil aren't standardized in the way you might expect them to work in certain other places. For example, in Canada, that's where I was born. Things are very standardized there. If you go to a national park website, those websites are very uniform across all the parks. In Brazil, things work differently everywhere. So you're going to find some park websites don't have up-to-date information. Other websites might say that there are certain trails that don't exist. There are some places where the parking is a little strange. For example, in the city of Paraty, you need to download an app to register for parking in the city. And the app is only available on Android, and it doesn't even work. So basically, you have to plan and do your own research. So that means going beyond just going to websites. It means maybe if you book an Airbnb, talk to the host, ask the host. It also means that if you're going to get to that location, you might actually have to do some research while you're there by actually going to the locations and figuring out if they're worth going to or not, because sometimes you just won't find anyone who has visited that location before and who has anything to say about it. So sometimes you're just going to have to go to that place and do your own footwork. And on that note, it also makes sense to have multiple backup plans. For example, if you want to visit a park, well, that's a good thing, and you can go to that place, but don't just rely on that one park if you can. Make sure there are other things to do around there, like trails, beaches, other places you can go to watch birds or do whatever kind of ecotourism you want to do. So that's what I recommend. You've got to really do your own research, have backup plans. You might have to do some guess and check, some of your own experimentation, but it's definitely worth it if you do, because you might find hidden gems that no one else has found, roads that no one else has birded on, etc. Tip number 4, cars. Now, if you want to do your own ecotourism that you're not, in other words, that you're not hiring a guide, you're going to have to rent a car, because that's the only way to get to these small towns or these small places or places with parks, etc. So you're going to rent a car, but there are a few things you should keep in mind about renting a car in Brazil. The first is that most cars here are manual transmission. Now, that's not true of all rental places, but some places, chances are, you might only be able to get a car with manual or standard transmission. So make sure you know how to drive a car with manual transmission. It's always a good skill to have. The second is that you should, of course, get your international driving permit. An international driving permit is basically a document that has a translation of your driver's license. And if you have that, you will be able to use that to drive legally in many countries, whereas your driving license from other countries, another country might not work. You probably can rent a car without one, but it's always a good idea to have one anyway. And it doesn't cost much. You just have to go to something like your CAA authority to get your international driving permit. And there you'll have a translation of your license into Portuguese. So if you're ever stopped, probably that'll never happen in Brazil, but if you're ever stopped, then you can show them this international driving permit. The final thing I want to recommend about cars, or say about cars, is that there are two kinds of fuels in Brazil. There's gasoline and ethanol. And the more common fuel is typically ethanol. So if you find yourself at a gas station, there are two kinds of fuels. Make sure the kind of car you rented is using the kind of fuel you're using at the gas station. Tip number 5 is get money. Now, chances are, in most places, your credit card will be accepted, but not all. So that's why I recommend getting physical cash, which is the real in Brazil. On that topic, I recommend getting something like a Wise card. A Wise card is just a card with the Wise service, the Wise currency exchange service, and they offer like a physical debit card. And you can load money onto that and pay with that card, and that will give you typically better rates, better exchange rates than your credit card. So your credit card will be accepted, but it's a good idea to bring money because I have been to many places where credit cards are not accepted. And in that case, you won't be able to buy anything like food or other stuff that you might need. Tip number 6. Use your brain when booking your accommodations. Now, Airbnbs, I typically stay in Airbnbs in Brazil, and they're pretty reliable, but I do recommend doing some research into where you are staying. For example, some Airbnbs, there was one Airbnb I stayed at where they were cutting the grass every day, and that was very annoying. So you can ask questions like, if an Airbnb is on a large property, do they do a lot of maintenance, or do they do maintenance when guests are around? That same Airbnb also had a couple of dogs on the property, and they followed me around when I was birding on the property, which was very annoying. And because dogs scare the birds away. And so you can also ask if there are a lot of dogs on the property, stuff like that. Things that might interfere with your ecotourism or viewing of birds or wildlife. It's a good idea to ask these specific questions to Airbnb hosts. Tip number 7, get WhatsApp. Now, I have to say, I hate Facebook, and I hate recommending anything that has to do with Facebook and Meta. I hope that corporation dies a horrible death and goes bankrupt. But I will have to say that communication in Brazil, a lot of it is done via WhatsApp, and some people only communicate via WhatsApp. For example, just a few months ago, I was at this research institute, and in order to get there early, we had to talk to them and send them a message, but they only accepted communications via WhatsApp. Some places might even state that they do bookings and things via email. That might be true, that might not, but they might actually use WhatsApp and only respond to WhatsApp. So unfortunately, it's a bad thing, but you might actually have to use that horrible application called WhatsApp to communicate with people in Brazil. Tip number 8 is get a SIM card for your phone. Now, it's almost oh, there's a bird over there. Anyway, okay. What was I talking about? Oh yes, your SIM card. Well, it's almost impossible to get a SIM card down here for your phone if you're just visiting. I mean, theoretically, there are some ways of doing it, but I would say in practice, it's almost impossible. So I really recommend getting a travel SIM for your phone. I use travel SIM, but there may be other SIM providers, but I found that travel SIM works okay. It may not work as well as some local providers, but at least it will provide you with basic data services so you can do things like call an Uber, check your reservations, check eBird, and other stuff like that. Tip number 9, charging your camera with adapters. Okay, so if you want to charge your batteries, you're going to have to use the electricity here. And if you're going to use the electricity, you're going to need an adapter. So the outlets or electrical plugs here are a little different than in North America. And of course, different in many other places of the world, like every other country. So you should get an adapter. They're fairly easy to find on Amazon or other places. You can get an adapter. And Brazil uses the same voltage as North America almost. It actually uses 127 volts, but that works with appliances from North America. I've tried it with all my chargers and all my electronics, and the voltage here works just the same, just as well as in North America, but you do need a plug adapter. Tip number 10 is don't rely too much on existing eBird hotspots. I'm a birder, so I use eBird to check where the birds are, where the best hotspots are. And birding is a thing in Brazil, but it's not as big a thing as in North America. So some of the hotspots may not seem like very impressive, but there are a ton of birds here. And so even hotspots that don't look that great or places with not many hotspots might be very good places to bird. And who knows, you might find some very nice birding hotspots all on your own. So just because an area of eBird that's shown on eBird doesn't have a lot of eBird hotspots doesn't mean it's not a good birding location. So you can use eBird as a starting point, but you should also not rely on it completely to tell you where the birds are. You kind of have to do a little bit of your own work to figure those out. For example, I mean, right here in this rainforest right now, there is no hotspot where I am right now, and yet there are some pretty nice birds here. So that's just my tip. Don't rely on eBird hotspots. You kind of have to figure out a lot of stuff about birds on your own. Tip number 11, bring a portable heater. This sounds a little strange because this is a tropical hot country. You might think, why bring a heater? But Brazil is very humid, especially in the many areas of the rainforest or these tropical forests here, these wet forests. And if you spend a significant amount of time in Brazil, your gear might start to get humid. I'm talking about binoculars, cameras, lenses, and they might start to get problems with the humidity. So I do recommend bringing a portable heater, just so you can put it on low heat, put it near your gear to keep your gear dry. It does a lot. You can dry out other things too, like your camera bag if it gets a little bit wet. Because, for example, if you're in a forest like this and your camera bag gets a little rain on it, it's not going to dry overnight in a very humid rainforest like this. But putting a heater on it will keep it nice and crisp at night. So I think it's a really crucial piece of equipment in addition to your main photography or birding gear or wildlife gear is a nice portable heater so you can keep things dry, especially at night. Conclusion. I think ecotourism in Brazil is pretty fun. It's pretty cool because there are many places like this. I'm in pretty much my own tropical forest right now with no one else around me. It's very beautiful and you can find lots of amazing wildlife that many people haven't seen. And Brazil does have a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a hard place to get to and things don't work quite right. And to some extent that's true, but I think if you just follow some of the basic tips I outlined in this video, you can have a very nice time in Brazil and you can do things that are off the beaten track that are a little bit different than some of the very popular ecotourism spots like Costa Rica and the Amazon. Well, that's in Brazil, part of that's in Brazil, but those main Central American and Northern South American touristic spots. If you come down to other parts of Brazil that aren't very well trodden, you can do lots of interesting things and see things that many people haven't seen before. So I do recommend giving Brazil a try, giving Brazil a consideration in terms of ecotourism. And I think if you do, you'll have a lot of fun. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a good time watching birds or doing whatever else you're doing, but if it's not watching birds, then it's probably not worth doing. And I'll see you again next time.